In this video, we'll introduce the basic histology of the digestive system. My intent here is not to talk about how the histology differs from organ to organ. When we go through each organ individually, we'll talk about that. Instead, what I want to do here is talk about the general pattern of the histology that you find along the digestive tract and introduce some terminology. So as a general pattern, you have initially the hollow center of the digestive tract. Of course, in the living organism, this is the space that would be filled with food and digestive juices and partially digested food materials and waste. This is called the lumen. So when you are trying to orient yourself on looking at a histological slide of the digestive tract, always look for the lumen first. The lumen is surrounded by a layer of epithelial cells. So epithelium is a barrier and lining tissue, so you should always look for epithelium around the lumen. And if you take this section and magnify it, you can see the epithelial cells along here. Individual epithelial cells. There, and you can even see some goblet cells. In this magnification, the lumen is there. Goblet cells are these cells that have the pale apical surface. Remember, the apical surface is the surface that faces into the lumen, and that pale portion is filled with mucus. That's why it looks a different color. Underneath the epithelium, you have connective tissue, and blood vessels and lacteals run through this connective tissue. Blood vessels to pick up nutrients that are being absorbed out of the lumen across the epithelial cells. Lacteals are the specialized, really wide-mouthed lymphatic vessels that absorb large fat molecules. And then lastly, around that connective tissue, you have layers of muscle. That's what this pink layer is, there and along there. That's the muscular layer. And I should state here that what you were looking at is the jejunum, so part of the small intestine. So instead of looking at the actual histology image, this is a more cartoon version that helps illustrate the 4 layers of the GI tract. So what we're looking at is a wedge of the GI tract. You can imagine this continuing around like that, but we've taken kind of a pie wedge out of it. Moving from the lumen outward, you have 4 layers. You've got the mucosa, and that runs from there to there. And then you have the submucosa, the Muscularis externa, and then the Serosa or adventitia is the outermost layer. And you find this pattern from the esophagus to the anus throughout the entire GI tract. Here we're looking at an image of the stomach, of a cross-section of the stomach. The mucosa is this whole thing. The mucosa includes the epithelium that lines the lumen, but there's also a connective tissue region to the mucosa and a thin, incomplete muscular layer forming part of the mucosa. The mucosa, since it's the epithelium, it includes the epithelium as well as supporting tissue. This is where you get mucus secreted, so it's called the mucosa because it's a moist membrane covered in mucus. Digestive enzymes are secreted by cells in the epithelium. Hormones are secreted by cells in the epithelium. This is also where absorption happens. Remember, it's the epithelial cells that form the barrier to absorption. So in order for nutrients to be absorbed, they have to cross the epithelium of the mucosa. You also find protection against infection. So when you have, there are cells in the mucosa that help eliminate infection from the food and water that you drink. And when you see Peyer's patches in the small intestine, they are open to the mucosa. Now the mucosa has sublayers, so it includes the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. So if you're looking at the wall of the digestive tract, when you're looking at the mucosa, you have the epithelial cells, you have a narrow band of underlying connective tissue, and a narrow band of smooth muscle cells. So you've got the lining epithelium, which is usually simple columnar, although there are variations that we'll talk about when we talk about individual organs in the digestive tract. There's mucus-secreting cells, also enzyme-synthesizing and hormone-secreting cells. Lamina propria is connective tissue. Lymphoid follicles are located here. That's that protection from infection. And then the muscularis mucosa is a band of smooth muscle cells. And these smooth muscle cells, they help with movement of the mucosa. They also, in the small intestine, where the mucosa is highly folded, it's the contraction of those smooth muscle cells that creates those folds. Here we're looking at the mucosa of the esophagus, the esophageal mucosa. Notice first off that in the esophagus the epithelium is very different. And in the esophagus the epithelium is stratified, squamous. But once you get past the esophagus, then you get to the simple columnar epithelium. So here's the overall picture, and here I have the mucosal epithelium, just the epithelial layer highlighted, the lamina propria, that connective tissue layer, highlighted, and then the muscularis mucosa highlighted. You can see it's the kind of bundles of muscle, smooth muscle fibers. Now back to our stomach slide. Below the mucosa you have the submucosa. The submucosa is typically areolar connective tissue. So loose connective tissue. It's full of blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, lymphoid follicles in the submucosa as well, and nerve fibers too. You may also, in some parts of the intestine, you have mucus-secreting glands. So in some parts of the digestive tract, you have goblet cells in the epithelium secreting mucus, but you also have deep glands rising from the submucosa. Moving out from the submucosa, you have the muscularis externae. So this is a double layer of muscle. You have an inner circular layer, an outer longitudinal layer, and it's mostly smooth muscle. The exception is in the uppermost regions of the esophagus. The uppermost regions of the esophagus, it's actually skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle controls that swallowing reflex. You have the two layers, they run opposite each other, so if you're looking at a cross-section of the intestinal wall, you have an inner circular layer that runs around like that, and an outer longitudinal layer that runs perpendicular. So in the muscularis externae, you would see one layer in longitudinal section and a layer around that where the bundles of muscle fibers will be in cross-section. The stomach actually has a third muscular layer because of the intense churning and pummeling that the stomach does. That third layer helps with that. And the muscularis externae is largely responsible for segmentation and peristalsis. It's contractions of the muscularis externae that do segmentation and the peristaltic waves that keep food moving along the digestive tract. The outermost layer is the serosa. It is areolar connective tissue covered in simple squamous epithelium. In most of the digestive tract, it's actually the visceral layer of the peritoneum. Remember, the peritoneum is that serous membrane that surrounds the abdominal organs. In a few places, it becomes a fibrous adventitia. And these are places that aren't surrounded by the peritoneum. So you have around the pharynx and around the esophagus. The pharynx is your throat, so up in the head and neck, and the esophagus runs through the thoracic cavity, so it's also not surrounded by the peritoneum. You also have adventitia around the rectum. The rectum is below the level of the peritoneum. And the adventitia is just a much thicker, more fibrous connective tissue than the serosa. Okay, so just as a quick overview, when we're talking about the digestive system, remember, first you have the lumen, the big empty space in the middle, and lining that lumen, you have the mucosa. And remember, the mucosa has its 3 sublayers. Underneath that, you have the submucosa. And outside of the submucosa, you have the Muscularis externae. And that has the 2 layers. Remember, the circular layer and the longitudinal layer. Lastly, on the outside, you have either serosa or adventitia, depending on where you are exactly in the digestive tract. Okay, so after studying this video, you should be able to identify and describe the 4 general layers of the GI tract, as well as the 3 sublayers of the digestive mucosa. I want you to be able to distinguish between the Muscularis mucosae and the Muscularis externa. So talk about, which is which, the Muscularis mucosa being the layer that's part of the mucosa, sometimes incomplete muscular layer, and the Muscularis externa being the thick muscular portion of the GI tract wall. And you should also be able to distinguish between the serosa and the adventitia, the serosa being the visceral layer of the peritoneum, so we're talking simple squamous epithelium and areolar connective tissue, and the adventitia, which is in those areas not covered by the peritoneum, a much more fibrous connective tissue.